At 1:47 in the morning, the camera on her porch went dark. Not because the battery died, not because of a storm. Someone made sure of that. And for a moment, just a moment, it probably looked like the perfect move. But here's the thing about perfect moves. They rarely are. Stick with me on this one, because what this case reveals in the next few minutes is not what you are expecting, and it changes the way you think about what actually gets people caught. Nancy Guth was 84 years old. She lived in Tucson, Arizona, and sometime in the early hours of a January morning, she was taken from her own bed. Not from her driveway, not from a parking lot. Her bed, while she was asleep, in her own home. Her family confirmed it. Law enforcement confirmed it. The Pima County Sheriff's Office went public with a warning that the suspect could act again, which, if you think about that statement carefully, tells you something important about how they see this person. Not as someone who panicked, not as someone who made a reckless decision in the dark, someone with enough confidence to be considered a continued threat. That detail matters. Keep it in mind. Now, the timeline. This is where the outline of this case starts to come into focus. At 1:47 a.m., the signal from the doorbell camera on Nancy's porch was interrupted. The motion sensor flickered, the feed cut, and then silence. Then at approximately 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. That connection between a medical device and a phone dropped, which means at 2:28 a.m. she was no longer near that phone, or the phone was no longer near her. 41 minutes. That is the window, from 1:47 to 2:28. And inside that window, something happened that the investigation is still working to fully reconstruct. But here is the problem, and this is what most coverage of this case completely missed. The camera being disabled? That was not the mistake. The mistake happened before that, in the seconds that the camera was still running. Because the footage that survived, the fragments of infrared frames that investigators pulled before the feed cut, showed something that nobody was initially looking for. It was not a face. There was no clear face. The figure was masked. The angle was limited. By most accounts, it looked like a dead end, but a SWAT commander assigned to this case brought something to a closed-door briefing weeks later that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. And it was not about DNA. It was not about fingerprints. It was not even about the ransom demand that came after. It was about the way this person walked. Think about that for a second. You go through all the trouble of disabling a camera, covering your face, moving in the dark, and the thing that exposes you is the way your body moves when you think the worst is already over. That is not a small detail. That is the kind of detail that changes everything. What the infrared frames captured, even in their degraded, partially corrupted state, was a figure moving through the shadows near that property. And the investigators who analyzed that footage were not looking for an identity. They were looking for a pattern, because when you cannot see a face, you study behavior, you study posture, you study the way someone occupies space. And what they saw, according to sources familiar with the case, did not look like someone navigating an unfamiliar property in the middle of the night. It did not look like someone feeling their way through the dark. There was no scanning. No hesitation at the uneven ground, no pause at corners or transitions where a stranger would naturally slow down to orient themselves. The movement looked practiced, deliberate, comfortable. And that, right there, is where things started to feel off. Because there is a very specific difference between how someone moves through a space they have never been in and how someone moves through a space they already know. Trained tactical operators learn to read this distinction. It shows in the shoulders. It shows in the length of each stride. It shows in what is absent, the small, almost invisible moments of recalibration that every person experiences when they are somewhere new. This person had none of those moments, not one. When investigators zoomed into the enhanced infrared frames, and this took time, this was not a quick process, they found something even smaller. Something that, on its own, would mean almost nothing. But in the context of everything else they were building, it meant quite a lot. There was a slight outward rotation in one foot, consistent across multiple strides, not dramatic, not the kind of thing you would notice watching someone walk down a street in broad daylight. But in a forensic analysis, frame by frame, it was there every single time. The same foot, the same angle, the same subtle deviation in the stride cycle. That is called a gait marker. And gait markers do not lie. The FBI ran calibration tests on the infrared distortion because infrared footage compresses and warps depending on distance and lighting conditions. And their initial estimates put this individual somewhere between approximately 5 feet 9 and 5 feet 10 inches tall. But here is what most people do not realize about gait analysis. Height is almost a secondary consideration. What the analysis actually reveals is proportion, the ratio of hip width to shoulder movement, the arc of arm swing, how stable the torso stays during each step, whether the weight shifts evenly or favors one side. All of that was extractable from those fragments of footage. And when investigators had that profile, that physical and behavioral composite, the question the case was asking completely changed. It stopped being who was in the vicinity of this property that night, and it became something far more specific, something far more uncomfortable. Who moves exactly like this? That shift matters more than it might seem, because the first question casts a wide net. The second question draws a circle. And circles, in an investigation like this, have a way of getting smaller. But something did not feel right about stopping there. Because knowing how someone moves is one thing. Understanding how they got away is another. And the exit, the route this person took after leaving that property, turned out to be its own kind of testimony. After the gait analysis changed the internal direction of the case, investigators expanded their focus outward, away from the porch, away from the property line, out into the road network surrounding that neighborhood in Tucson. And what they were doing was not just reviewing footage. They were building a map, license plate readers on the main roads out of the area, traffic cameras at key intersections, security systems from nearby businesses, even residential cameras that were not pointed at Nancy's home, but happened to capture the traffic patterns on surrounding streets during that early morning window. Thousands of hours. Reviewed and cross-referenced. What they were specifically looking for was not simply a suspicious vehicle. They were looking for repetition. A vehicle that appeared once could be anything: a delivery driver, someone coming off a late shift, a rideshare. A vehicle that appeared twice starts to look intentional. A vehicle that appeared on a prior date and again on the night of the disappearance starts to look like something else entirely. And that is when things change. At least one vehicle attracted a level of scrutiny that went beyond a routine check. Not because it ran a red light. Not because it accelerated suddenly or made erratic turns. The opposite, actually. It moved through the area with a kind of calm that investigators found notable. Efficient route. No unnecessary detours. Avoided the major intersections, the ones with the most cameras, the most traffic sensors, but not in a way that added significant travel time, just in a way that suggested familiarity. The kind of familiarity you build from driving the same roads many times, not the frantic, wide-eyed escape of someone who just did something terrifying for the first time. Something about that calmness did not add up, because panic leaves traces. Adrenaline changes driving behavior. People speed up when they should not. They brake too hard. They take wrong turns and overcorrect. The body under extreme stress does not perform cleanly. It makes small, detectable errors. This vehicle did not make those errors. And that detail, that absence of panic, echoed directly back to what the SWAT commander had described about the movement on the porch footage. The same quality. Practiced, settled, controlled. Now, here is where the case takes a turn that most people following it publicly were not prepared for. Because investigators did not just find footage of this vehicle from the night Nancy disappeared. They found footage from before, weeks before. A similar silhouette, a similar build, captured near the same corridor, during the same early morning hours. Not once, more than once. And at that point, when you layer prior presence on top of behavioral familiarity on top of a practiced exit route, the word investigators started using internally was not surveillance. It was not reconnaissance in the traditional sense either. The word was rehearsal. This is where things start to feel off in a way that is hard to explain and even harder to dismiss, because a rehearsal implies a performance, and a performance implies a target, and a target at that level of specificity. An 84-year-old woman in her home, in the dark, approached through a carefully timed window does not happen by accident. It does not happen on impulse. Someone had been planning this. Not for days, potentially for weeks. And the first mistake, the one the camera caught before it went dark, was not walking into frame. It was coming back to the same location enough times that the pattern became visible. Because one visit can be explained away, but repetition has a logic to it, and that logic pointed somewhere very specific. The question now was not whether this was random. The evidence was already pushing hard against that conclusion. The question was becoming something far more personal, far more unsettling. How well did this person actually know Nancy Guth? Before 1:47 in the morning, there was nothing. No movement, no signal disruption, no visible activity near the property. Just silence. Just darkness. Just a house that looked from the outside like every other house on that street. But that silence was not empty. Investigators started looking at the period before the camera cut out. Not the moment of interference. That was already documented. The moments leading up to it. The window of stillness that preceded everything. And what they found, or more accurately what they started to suspect, was that the stillness itself was not accidental. It was deliberate, because motion sensors have a geometry to them. There is a range within which they activate, and there is a range just outside that boundary where someone could position themselves and remain completely invisible to the system. Someone who knew that boundary existed. Someone who knew exactly where to stand. That is not something you figure out in the moment. That is something you learn in advance. Tactical analysts who study pre-event behavior will tell you that one of the most overlooked elements in cases like this is the waiting period. People focus on the entry, they focus on the exit, but the wait, that controlled, patient, calculated stillness before anything happens, that is where the psychology lives. Staying in the dark outside someone's home long enough for every light to go off, for every sound inside to settle, for the house to go completely quiet, that requires something most people underestimate. It requires certainty, not just patience. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing how the people inside that house behave, knowing their schedule, knowing their rhythm, knowing that when the lights go off, they stay off. And this is where things started to feel off in a way that went far beyond the footage. Because how do you know that? How do you know with enough confidence to sit in the dark and wait, without hesitation, without second guessing, that the person inside is not going to get up for a glass of water, or turn on a light, or do any of the unpredictable things people do in the middle of the night? You know it because you have watched long enough to understand the pattern. Or you know it because someone told you. Or you know it because you have been inside that house before. Those are three very different possibilities, and investigators were quietly working through all three. Nancy Guth was 84 years old. And what the public record confirms is that she lived alone, she had a routine, and she was taken from her bed, not from a common area, not from near a door, her bed, in the dark, without apparent struggle loud enough to trigger any kind of alarm or external attention. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Going directly to a bedroom in an unfamiliar house in complete darkness without hesitation. That is not something that happens by luck. It is not something you manage on instinct in an environment you have never navigated before. Your body does not cooperate. Your depth perception is off. Your spatial memory has nothing to work with. You bump into furniture. You misread distances. You slow down at every threshold because you genuinely do not know what is on the other side. But something does not add up here, because none of that appears to have happened. The entry point, according to sources familiar with the investigation, did not reflect the chaotic signature of a violent forced intrusion. It was controlled, quiet. The kind of access that suggests either an extraordinary level of skill or a very specific kind of prior knowledge. Knowledge about which entry points were least likely to make noise. Knowledge about which sounds would carry through the house and which would not. Knowledge that only comes from one of two places: professional training or personal familiarity with that specific home. Investigators were not overlooking either possibility. And here is the problem with the familiarity angle. The more you pull on it, the more it pulls back. Because the lights on that property were on a timer. The porch light cut off automatically at a certain hour. The interior lights followed a consistent pattern that was visible from outside. The same sequence, the same timing, night after night. A predictable rhythm. And predictable rhythms are dangerous because they create windows, and windows create opportunities. And someone who had observed that property long enough would have known exactly when that window opened. 1:47 in the morning was not a random time. It was specific. It was chosen. And the choice of that precise moment suggests that whoever made it understood the household well enough to predict when it would be at its most vulnerable. That is when investigators started asking the questions that press conferences do not cover. Not who is in the area, not who matches the physical profile, but something closer, something more personal. What do you think really happened here? Because the evidence that was quietly building inside this investigation was starting to point somewhere that changed the entire shape of the case. Leave your theory in the comments. We are going to keep pulling on this thread. Now, around this same time, something else entered the picture. Something that on the surface looked like a motive. Like a clear, simple explanation for everything that had happened. A ransom demand. Cryptocurrency. A Bitcoin wallet address sent to media outlets, and for a moment it probably felt like the case had found its center of gravity. A kidnapping for money, a demand, a transaction. Clean and terrible, and in some ways, legible. But something did not feel right, because look at everything that preceded that demand. The weeks of apparent reconnaissance, the precise timing, the behavioral familiarity, the controlled entry, the practiced exit. Every element of this case pointed to someone careful, someone methodical, someone who thought multiple moves ahead. And then, this same person chooses to communicate via a method that leaves a digital trail, sends a message to media outlets, creates or uses a crypto wallet that investigators can examine for prior activity, for metadata, for timing patterns. That is not consistent, and inconsistency in a case this deliberate is worth noticing. Analysts who study ransom communications look at more than just the content. They look at the tone. Is it hurried or composed? Is the language emotional or transactional? Does it read like someone who is scared of getting caught? Or someone who believes they have already controlled the narrative? They look at the timing of the demand relative to the event, because an early demand suggests confidence. A delayed demand can suggest something else, a person watching to see what investigators reveal publicly before deciding how to position themselves. The ransom note, in other words, may not be what it appears to be. It may not be the motive. It may be a layer, a constructed surface designed to direct attention in a specific direction, while the real architecture of this case remains underneath. And if that is true, if the ransom angle was at least partially a redirection, then the question is not who wanted money from Nancy Guth's family. The question is, who wanted something else? Something that money cannot fully explain. That is the thread investigators were quietly following. Not the Bitcoin wallet. Not the dollar amount of the demand, the behavior underneath all of it, the pattern that existed before the ransom note was ever written, because patterns do not start on the night of the crime. They start earlier, sometimes much earlier. And the pattern in this case, the rehearsals, the familiarity, the knowledge of routine, the comfort in the dark, that pattern had a shape, and the shape of it was pointing towards someone close. Not close in distance necessarily, close in knowledge, close in access, close in the specific, intimate understanding of one woman's daily life that would have been required to execute what happened on that January morning in Tucson with that level of precision. And that is an uncomfortable place for an investigation to arrive, because it means the circle of people who could have done this is not wide. It was never wide, it was always small. And small circles, when you start to close them, tend to contain people with names, people with histories, people with reasons. The investigation knew that, and they were already working inside that circle long before any of it became public. There is something investigators in complex cases understand that most people following from the outside never fully appreciate. Silence has a signature, not the silence of someone who was simply not there, rare. The specific, deliberate silence of someone who understood exactly what investigators would be looking for and removed themselves from it. Those are two completely different things. And the difference between them is detectable. Cell tower data from the area surrounding Nancy's home during that 1:47 to 2:28 window was part of what investigators quietly pulled in the early stages of this case. Cross-referencing signal activity near a crime scene during a defined time window is standard procedure. What you are looking for is not just presence, it is pattern. Whose device was near that location? How often? At what hours? Whether that pattern changed after the event. But here is where things get more complicated, because sophisticated actors, people who have thought carefully about what they are doing, sometimes anticipate exactly that kind of search. They leave their phones at home. They power down their devices. They try to create a digital absence that functions as an alibi. No signal means no placement. No placement means no connection. Except that is not actually how it works anymore, because your phone going dark does not erase you from the environment. It just means investigators look at everything around you instead. Traffic sensors embedded in road infrastructure capture timestamps of vehicles passing specific points. Gas stations record transaction times. ATMs log activity. Commercial security cameras on storefronts capture the street outside, whether or not anyone inside the store is watching. Neighborhood cameras pointed at driveways catch ambient movement on the road behind them. All of it timestamped. All of it archived. And when those environmental data points, none of them individually definitive, none of them by themselves enough to place anyone anywhere, when they start to cluster around the same window, the same corridor, the same direction of travel as the event itself, investigators call that a convergence cone, a narrowing field of probability built not from one strong piece of evidence, but from many quiet ones pressing in the same direction. The digital silence, in other words, became its own data point, because the absence of a signal in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, when everything around that absence tells a specific story, is not nothing. It is a shape, and shapes can be read. That is what was building internally in this investigation, while the public coverage focused on the ransom note and the search operations. A model, patient, methodical, built from behavioral fragments and environmental timestamps, and the kind of forensic detail that does not make for clean headlines, but makes for very solid case architecture. And the model had a profile, a specific physical behavioral profile, someone of a defined height range, a distinctive gait, familiarity with the property and its interior, knowledge of the surrounding road network, access to a vehicle that appeared in the area more than once, awareness of the household routine specific enough to time an approach with precision, and the emotional composure, or something that looked like composure, to wait, to move, to exit, and then to go quiet. That is not a wide description. That is a narrow one. Now, here is what the SWAT commander's observation actually means when you step back and look at the full picture. Because it is easy to hear gait analysis and think it sounds like science fiction, like something from a crime procedural that would never hold up in a real investigation. But that is not accurate. Law enforcement agencies, particularly tactical units and federal investigators, have been using behavioral pattern analysis as a supplementary tool for years. It does not replace traditional forensic evidence, but it directs resources. It narrows the field. It tells investigators where to look when the conventional entry points are blocked. And what the Gait analysis did in this case was not identify a suspect. It changed the question being asked, which, in an investigation that had limited clear footage and a deliberately obscured point of entry, was arguably more valuable than a partial fingerprint or an inconclusive DNA result. Because you can contest a fingerprint. You can challenge a DNA match. But behavioral familiarity, the kind that shows up in how a person moves through a space at 2 in the morning, that is harder to construct an argument against. It lives in the body. It does not change based on what you are wearing or whether your face is covered. Muscle memory, as one source close to the investigation apparently noted, does not have a delete function. But here is what I keep coming back to, and this is less about the forensics and more about the psychology of the whole thing. Because if you accept, and the evidence pushes fairly hard in this direction, that this person knew the property, knew the routine, knew the interior layout well enough to navigate it in darkness, knew the timing well enough to choose a 41-minute window with precision, then you are not describing a stranger. You are describing someone for whom Nancy Guth was not a random target. She was a specific one. And that distinction carries weight that the ransom note cannot fully absorb, because ransom implies financial motive. It implies a transaction. It implies that the target was chosen for what she had, or what her family had. But the level of personal knowledge embedded in the execution of this, the intimate familiarity with her schedule, her home, her habits, that kind of knowledge is not purchased. It is accumulated over time through proximity. That is the part of this case that investigators were sitting with privately long before any of it became visible publicly. Not who wanted money, but who had been close enough for long enough to know all of this. And then, this is the phase of the investigation that rarely gets discussed because it is not dramatic, it is not visible, and it does not produce press conferences. Investigators started watching, not for new evidence necessarily, for behavior. Because once a case reaches a certain stage of internal development, once the circle has been drawn and the profile has been built, the investigation itself becomes a tool for observation. Media coverage slows. Public updates become sparse. The surface of the case goes quiet, and that quiet is deliberate. Because how someone behaves when they believe the pressure has eased, when the cameras are not pointed at them, when the news cycle has moved on, when the silence starts to feel like safety, that behavior is often more revealing than anything captured in the immediate aftermath of an event. People make adjustments when they feel watched, but they reveal themselves when they believe they are not. A sudden change in routine, an unexpected relocation, unusual financial activity, new contacts that do not fit an established social pattern, small shifts that individually mean nothing, but mapped against a behavioral baseline, against what this person looked like before, begin to tell a story that the investigation adds to its growing file. Sustained pressure over time produces what investigators sometimes call behavioral fractures. Not dramatic confessions, not obvious mistakes, small cracks, subtle inconsistencies between how someone presents themselves and how they actually move through the world when the stakes feel lower. And those cracks, in a case built on convergence, are exactly what close the remaining distance. That is where this investigation appeared to be heading. Not toward a single explosive revelation, toward an accumulation. A slow, methodical stacking of small consistencies. Behavioral, forensic, digital, spatial, until the weight of them together becomes impossible to answer. 7 data points that individually bend toward probability. Together, they point in one direction. And at some point, not announced, not telegraphed, the investigators following that direction stop needing to ask where it leads. The darkness hid his face. But the case was never really about his face. It was about everything his face was attached to. The way he walked. The route he chose, the time he selected, the knowledge he carried, the patience he demonstrated, the silence he maintained afterward. None of those things can be masked, and somewhere inside the narrowing circle of this investigation, in a city where someone is living their life, going through their days, perhaps believing that the absence of an arrest means the absence of a case being built, that person may not fully understand what convergence actually means until the moment it is complete. Because that is the final thing about convergence cases that most people miss. They do not announce themselves. They do not build to a visible crescendo. They simply reach a threshold. And when they do, investigators do not celebrate. They prepare. Because once charges are filed in a case like this, every timestamp, every behavioral note, every fragment of infrared footage, every environmental data point will be examined under conditions designed specifically to find the weakest link. And you do not move until you are certain there is no weak link left to find. The search for Nancy Guth is still active. The suspect has not been publicly named. And the investigation continues. Not loudly, not visibly, but with the particular kind of determination that comes from already knowing more than it has said. The question is not whether the circle has been drawn. The question is how much the person standing inside it understands about how close the edges already are. Final psychological reflection. One last thought. And this is just something I find myself turning over. When someone knows a person well enough to predict their every move, their sleep schedule, their routines, the layout of their home, at what point does that familiarity stop being proximity and start being something that was always going to end badly? That is not a question the evidence answers, but it might be the most important question in this case. Notebook V thanks you for watching this one all the way through. That means something, genuinely. This case stays with you after the screen goes dark. And maybe that is the point. Nancy Guth is still out there. The people looking for her are still working. Leave your theory below. We will be watching this one closely. We always do.